Welcome to the seventh in this season of overheard conversations, these Sunday sessions. It's a great pleasure to be joined tonight by Maura O'Connor. I have been enthusing for months about this book that arrived in the post. The wonderful cover, Ignition, Lighting Fires in a Burning World. Some of you will have heard me speak about it in different contexts because it's been really weaving in and out of my thinking. I usually start these conversations by asking you to just say something about where you call home.
Yeah, I these days call home Brooklyn, New York. This apartment that I'm in now is a place that me and my partner have lived in for almost 13 years, and we live on the south side of a beautiful 500-acre park that sits right in the heart of Brooklyn. And that's kind of where we spend all of our time. We're raising 3 boys here, and the park is kind of our home. Yeah, it's an interesting question because I definitely grew up moving across the country. My dad's from like a very working class neighborhood in the north side of Dublin. My mom's from like rural upstate New York. We moved from the East Coast to the West Coast and back again all over. So this is the longest I've actually ever lived in a place in my whole life, which is kind of unusual for someone who's in middle age. So
Well, good to hear and good to get a little sense of where you're speaking from. And thinking about this book, I guess one place we could start from is just with what immediately comes to mind for people when they hear or read news stories about wildfires and mega fires. And it's often, and I think there are moments in my book where I kind of invoke this in passing. It's this kind of very potent image for the sort of most terrifying manifestations of climate change in the present tense. And part of why I've been thinking so much with your book is because it's absolutely faithful to the role of climate change within what we're talking about when we talk about these massive fires. But you're also introducing us to the parts that go missing from the story in the way that tends to be represented, and the way that that not being the whole story can actually become misleading if we don't bring the rest of it into the picture. So I thought maybe for anyone who's listening in who hasn't had the chance to read your book yet, it might be helpful to just hear a bit more about that and what goes missing from the way that we're often thinking and talking about the mega fires and the state of wildfires today.
it's a great place to start, because I think as a journalist, and I kind of refer to myself as a science journalist because that's mostly the realm of my interest and of the last 10 years or so. But my own assumptions about fire were absolutely the same as the general public in every way. Like I didn't grow up in a different way that gave me some special insight into fire. I came to the subject with a lot of ideas about what it is and what it means. And I think even before it's kind of become synonymous with the climate crisis, fire is something that many of us are raised to just believe is inherently dangerous. And if you see it in an uncontrolled way, something is wrong or something has gone wrong and it's a threat. And so what I've noticed a lot, and particularly since now I've spent the last 4 years just really deep into the subject matter, is that wildfires become completely a kind of shorthand for the climate crisis. Like you don't even question when a journalist or a writer, somebody says the climate crisis as evidenced in flooding, wildfires, this, and even more so, it's almost become a symbol of a sort of burning world, in the sense of explosions of fossil fuel use and all of these things. And so the way that I've often like to work as a science journalist or as a journalist in general is like, I'm really fascinated by facts that completely subvert our ideas of the way the world works and of a story that has been missed. And so the first evidence that I had that there's like this story that just hasn't really been fully told or sort of entered into our public consciousness in a meaningful way was in Australia, where I saw burned ground and was told like this was actually lit intentionally for ecological benefit. And it just really sort of threw me for a loop. One, because I didn't know anything about fire ecology, and two, because I didn't know that people, particularly, you know, in Australia, it's Aboriginal people, light fires intentionally, and that is a good thing. That just was so alien to me and so unheard of that it really got, you know, it was like, oh, there's got to be a story here because I don't understand that at all. And that was the start of what I kind of have come to think of as like an aesthetic revolution for myself too, from like thinking fire is ugly and bad and scorched ground is evidence of a sort of tragedy to like now thinking it's absolutely beautiful. And so the whole what that even looks like and represents has like just completely flipped for me, which is my favorite kind of story. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm something that came up for me just as I was listening to you speak about that is I found myself saying now and then, I feel like one of the sort of habitual flaws of modernity is a loss of the ability to distinguish between bad and dangerous.
Mm.
And that if something is dangerous, it's treated as if it's bad. And fire is, you know, an archetypal example of something that is dangerous inherently, but only ever bad contextually.
Mm.
And that, you know, the difficulty in making that distinction somehow is deep in the mix of how the relationship to fire goes wrong.
Mm.
Because that's part of the story you're telling is that, yeah, you encounter it in Australia, and then you find within the histories of North America how, you know, not that far away from the surface, there has been that kind of relationship to fire among both indigenous and settler
Mm.
communities. And there's a particular move of scientific management at a particular moment in time that treats all of that as anachronistic. Is that a fair summary of the sort of how fire became demonized, let's say, within in the United States and North America?
Yeah, absolutely. I think basically between my experience in Australia to like having an idea about this book was like definitely a few years where I sort of like was picking up on certain pieces of information that then became an idea of investigating this topic and using it as a way to think about climate and history and land management policy. And so I also was not aware of the history in North America of intentional fire use, which dates back many, many, many thousands and thousands of years. And really actually is almost puts like the last 100 or like 150 years of land management in this continent in North America. It's really like a departure from what was the norm before. And yet we really to have a living memory of like intentional use of fire as a land management tool here is kind of several generations lost. It's rare to find communities around North America where people, this has been uninterrupted or people have a living memory of using fire in this way, but they do actually exist. And so what became appealing to me was like basically trying to find who are the people today that know how to use this tool? How did they get that knowledge? You know, was it from because they were raised in an indigenous community and that's always been a part of their tradition? Or is it because they were a firefighter who became really interested in why they're going out and fighting 100,000 acre fires that are just blowing everything up. Like, why is this happening? And so then they get interested in this kind of forgotten history, I would say. And then what became, I think, appealing for me for different reasons was like to learn from them directly by being out working with them. And part of because fire is dangerous if you don't understand it or kind of know how it, how it works, and if you're not prepared and such, and but can also be quite benign. The process of learning about it, and also I think some of that inherent risk and danger, was appealing to me. And so I really wanted to learn from those communities of people that still had that knowledge. And in fact, not only do they exist, but it's like what I kind of would describe as a movement. I don't think it's kind of dispersed and it's manifests in different ways, but from my perspective, I see it as a movement of people who are trying to bring this knowledge into our everyday approach to environmental management, and also as a solution for climate issues.
Part of what I get excited about in the book, and actually just listening to you speak about it now, is it has this quality of being a movement at which people arrive from different directions, a movement that doesn't map straightforwardly onto ordinary or kind of typical polarized political fault lines. And it's a kind of living example of how we can end up alongside each other, having come by different paths without having to agree on everything or sit down and make a common plan. It's like fire and this relationship to the skills of using fire well as part of deep involvement with living landscape becomes a kind of boundary object at which people can arrive and work together. And I feel like in that way, one of the things that the book does is it's a really powerful case study in the kind of alliances, the kind of coming together that I'm always trying to gesture towards and write towards when I talk about the work in the ruins. And I'm kind of curious as well about your own journey into training as a wildland firefighter, and you tell the story of this in the book. And I guess it was kind of during the pandemic that you were starting to train. Was it kind of bound up with that strange moment that we were all living through in one way or another?
It was. And it's funny because there's some things that aren't in the book. And like, one is like, when the lockdown started, we were one of the people who retreated from the city. We had strangely just bought this cabin in the woods, like less than 6 months before. It was a very strange sequence of events. And I ended up being kind of the caretaker during that lockdown period. And so I didn't work for months. And then I remember one afternoon I had to myself was like, the minute I have kind of like space to just sort of think in this way that I hadn't really been operating the previous months, the seeds of this book just like automatically kind of came together. And I remember I was like, oh, here's my whole proposal, like it's all right here. So it was really interesting because for me, it was bound up in that experience of the pandemic. And I think I almost designed the book by putting in this element of like, okay, I'm actually going to try to at least get as close as I can. At that time, I didn't know if I would be allowed to do the work, but if I could even just get close enough to observe it, I was going to do that intentionally because I was so eager to kind of get into the world and also like challenge myself physically. If there's like aspects of being a writer that I really truly hate, and I really wanted to just be engaged in a very different way where I was actually learning extremely like tangible, concrete skills. But because of the pandemic, I ended up doing a lot of the upfront training online. and then showing up to work on my first fire with a crew, never having seen fire on the ground, which was very kind of odd. Like I didn't know what to expect. I had like a bunch of sort of disconnected pieces of information about fire behavior from these online courses, but had never even like sort of smelled smoke on a grass fire before, really. So that was quite interesting. And like I remember the first day they lit a fire, it was quite small and contained. We were just doing a little demonstration around a telephone pole burning the grass, and it was like unbelievable. I was like, the flames, they're like 2-3 feet off the ground. I couldn't believe it. And that burn with that crew, we were supposed to burn like 3,000 acres. And so going from that to how we were going to burn that much land just seemed totally incomprehensible to me. And then by the end, I was just like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, maybe. I don't know. Because it was so amazing. It was very profound to be engaging with this element, with this group of people who, like you said, came from everywhere and ranged in age from like kids to people in their 60s. Like it wasn't like something I had experienced before, really.
I think something that came through to me very clearly reading the book is, it's quite possible to write a book and stay in the role of the journalist. And that first time when you show up to the fire, you sort of describe someone calling over to you, are you the journalist?
Yeah, so much disdain. I'm totally used to that. I often show up apologizing for being a journalist. I'm like, I should just say, tell me your worst experience with journalists now so that I can do my damage control up front. I have to reassure people I'm not like the others.
Well, I loved when we were talking the other day, and you said, "Oh yeah, I went back to the Treks thing that you're going to at the start of the book. I went back this year, and I didn't have the excuse of writing a book anymore." And they all sort of laughed.
Yeah.
But it's very clear in the book that you don't stay behind the safety of being the journalist. That you're doing this for real in a bunch of senses, including that you absolutely do get right into the thick of things, learning the skills, practicing, working alongside people, but also you're there as the relationship you have with them is not simply the professional relationship of a journalist.
Yeah, and it was surprising to me how quickly that happened, because really the first crew that I worked with, there was people on that crew who are coming from California. So in my conversations with them, they upfront put what they were doing and the reasons for being there in the context of like very traumatic events that they were experiencing back home. And that for them, like this training and being on these crews and learning how to like bring this experience and the practical knowledge they were gaining back home to protect their communities, was like so direct and opened up this whole other aspect of the story, which was like about people's mental health, about their trauma around these fires, and about it became a story that was less about like the science and more about these individuals who this was not abstract in any way. And so I kind of, it just became a matter of me realizing early on that to have like real conversations and to really understand the experience of people who are doing this type of work, I just really needed to build trust and really wanted to build that trust in order to understand what I was hearing and seeing, and then asking for permission a lot to be able to tell some of those stories in the book, because they were very personal in ways that before, when I was interviewing conservation biologists or something for my other work, wasn't quite the same sense of like being given something so sensitive and so, yeah, like personal.
Being entrusted with
Yeah, very
story.
much, very much.
Yeah, definitely that comes across in the book. And I mean, I'm interested as well in just thinking about um, the climate change side of this. One of the passages in the book that I've kept coming back to is about halfway through, when you're in the middle of this massive, terrifying fire in California, and this guy who lives in the valley where you're working kind of comes out of the smoke and is kind of talking animatedly with you all, and it's really clear from the way he's talking that he knows this place, he's grounded in it, he cares about it, he has a deep understanding of the changes he's seeing going on in his place. And at a certain point you say to him, so, you know, do people around here talk about climate change much? And he's like, there are very, very few Democrats around
Yeah.
here. And then he says, you know, like, even I don't believe in climate change. And that's one of the stories from the book that I've been talking about in a lot of conversations, because I think it's really revealing. And I think that he brings something into focus there. Like, I've been asked to speak at this climate and religion summer school in Cambridge next month. And I'm going to start with that story because I think, you know, what's so clear in that encounter is, yeah, like there is a bunch of people for whom climate change is an item of belief within a bundle of identity defining beliefs.
Yeah.
And he has a very clear-sighted sense of how he would be likely to be received
Yeah.
in a setting like that, and that he would not belong there. He's not. And so I think he's actually revealing to us something that's often hidden about the extent to which a certain relationship to believing in climate change really does function in a kind of pseudo-religious way, which is nothing to do with questioning the science of it, but just recognizing the way that that science is mobilized politically and as a matter of social
Yeah.
identity. And I feel like that it's the clearest sort of most honest description of an encounter that reveals that I've come across.
I think what was so interesting is he also follows it up by saying, like, I don't believe in climate change. Like, I'm a Christian and I believe in that, like the end times, basically, is what he's saying. So when he looks at like that fire and what it did, or the fact that there was this incredible drought and the animals that he's seeing, or that he's not able to hunt anymore, it's like what he's seeing is the same thing as like someone tracking climate change, but he's seeing the end times. And I think one thing for me as a journalist is like, because my parents come from very, very different places. My mom's family is politically conservative, rural. I've always kind of been able to switch perspectives, and I'm very suspicious of ideology and dogma. I kind of like, I feel like I have this little like sensor where I can feel when people have bought, lock, stock, and barrel into a worldview. And I don't think anything really works that way. And so it's always kind of made me just a little bit of a skeptic, I think. And like a really profound moment for me as a science journalist was when I was writing my first book about conservation and species extinction. And I had a conservation biologist who said to me, conservation is more like a religion than a science. We can say we would prefer to have these animals in the world, but is the world going to end because they're not there? No. But so often of science journalism is presented as this, like, if basically like we have to save nature in this way that is so, I think, kind of missing a lot of nuance and understanding and history, and just ways of the way that even science journalism is conceiving of what nature is and isn't seems sort of like missing something, or a more interesting story, actually. So yeah, like talking to that guy was really interesting. And I think for me too, the important thing is that I don't believe that he cared any less about the fate of his home and what was happening to his community than say, somebody else who's coming to it from somewhere else, but like cares a lot about this issue, or in theory about the environment and what happens to it, just so. Yeah, I think for me it's a continual learning process that, like, despite political ideologies, like the level of care someone can feel towards a place and the level of attachment that they have towards that place is not necessarily any qualitatively different from someone else's. And so that's very powerful.
Yeah, and that can be held within different belief frames.
Yes,
And people who hold, I mean, in that case, he's a local guy who you're running into, but it could equally have been someone you were working alongside on a crew. People could
absolutely.
be operating from different belief frames and able to be alongside each other, you know, caring equally strongly and cooperating with each other in the moment with the skills that you're each bringing to a situation. And it feels, I mean, there's another passage later on in the book. There's a chapter where prayer kind of comes into it, both from the sort of indigenous perspective and also the Christian faith of some of the
Yeah.
people you're working alongside. And I found the fact that prayer came up in the book really interesting to me as well.
Yeah, that's like such a good that's like one of these moments as a journalist where you're just like, oh, thank you, journalism gods, for giving me this scene that I can describe. But it was personally profound too, because basically I was on the Yurok reservation, which is like, as they describe, a fire dependent culture. Without fire, their culture cannot survive. And so there's been a resurgence after decades and decades of being criminalized for setting fires, to actively reintroducing fire to the landscape in this part of Northern California. So what Dougal's describing is that before a fire, at one point, two of the women said a prayer in Yurok, and another man that worked for a federal agency said a prayer in Shoshone, and then another one said a prayer to Jesus. And the three of them, as the fire was beginning, said this prayer. It's also a practice. One of the women would come around the crew as we were doing our briefing with a root of a plant and smoke us all with it. And the first time she did that, actually brought tears to my eyes. It's not that you don't feel respected on a crew or something, but to sort of explicitly recognize each of us and sort of smoke us in and sort of pray over us for our safety, and also sort of acknowledging the goodness of what we're doing and why we're there, was just like an amazing moment for me. And so yeah, I think there is like a lot of, I think, a beauty in this picture of people coming together and doing this kind of work. And in some places it's more explicit than others. And like the Yurok reservation was one of those places where it just absolutely does feel like the act of doing it is a kind of prayer. And that's part of their tradition that they allowed people to share in, like me.
I can completely imagine that. It reminds me of during the pandemic, I was part of a group that was brought together by Vanessa, who wrote Hospicing Modernity, and other members of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. And they convened us for this series of 8 calls over 8 weeks. And at the first call, they said, and while we're here, two of the communities that we're working with, one in Canada and one in Brazil, are sitting in ceremony for the work that we will be doing on this call.
Hmm.
And just the kind of the quieting effect of realizing that there are people who are taking what you're doing seriously enough that they are, from what they carry in their culture, sitting with a ceremonial fire while you are having this meeting for the good of the work that you will do in this meeting. I mean, that's the closest I've had to the experience you describe of the woman who's
Yeah.
smoking. I completely recognize what a powerful experience that is to be held in. And I mean, the other thing that struck me near the end of the book is you have a little passage where you nod towards you don't name him, but Jonathan Franzen's oh, what if we stop pretending article, which went viral a few years ago. And a little bit in some ways like the original Uninhabitable Earth article. It's one of those pieces that just kind of catches fire in a certain way because it speaks something that lots of people are secretly feeling in the middle of the night. And it puts it out there with a kind of a name and a publication attached to it that makes it speakable. But and you're rightly, I think, kind of saying, you know, that can be, it can be very easy to sort of take that sort of the attitude that can be embodied in a line like that when you're a long way away from like the front line of where this is playing out and has been playing out for a long time, where for, you know, some of those communities that you're working with, worlds ended already generations ago, and they're living in the aftermath of the end of a world, and that's part of the story that you're telling. But it was that was particularly interesting for me because that line, when Jonathan Franson's article went viral, I had a bunch of people sending it to me because I'd written this thing years earlier where I said, what do we do after we stop pretending? And Charlotte Ducan from Dark Mountain even wrote to Franson without knowing him and just said, I think you should have credited Dougal. You should have referenced Dougal in this thing you've written. And he said, I have strong feels about attribution, but honestly, I've never heard of the guy, which I completely believe. And you know, it doesn't matter because the work of culture is anyway contributing to a commons where your language travels and spreads and gets adapted, and it shouldn't need to have a name tag attached to it. But what came home to me thinking about that passage in your book, it sent me back to that. It made me realize, oh, two words go missing from the line that I wrote to the line that Franson wrote, and they're do and after. There's a big difference between what do we do after we stop pretending and what if we stop pretending.
Yeah.
What if we stop pretending leaves us in a kind of it's all over state. And it struck me that the very people who are most likely to believe in climate change in terms of the set of identities and their geographies and professional backgrounds and educations and so on that they, maybe I should be saying we have, are often also the people who find it hardest to imagine an after, hardest to imagine having anything to contribute to the doing, because the kinds of skills that are called for look a lot more like the skills of the people who you're meeting in the course of the book than they do of, you know, people who are sitting in big cities writing columns for magazines. And that's just a very humbling thing for those of us who lie closer to the, you know, writing columns for magazines end of the spectrum in our work history. But I feel like you sort of, yeah, again, I'm pointing people towards your book because it models what it's like as someone who, you know, has a lot of the kind of credentials and life experience and so on that go with that, going on the journey of acquiring the kinds of skills that might actually be useful in the kind of world that we're in and headed further into.
Yeah, it's why at the end of the book I write about like taking the chainsaw course and like learning how to use a chainsaw, because I was thinking, oh, like maybe it's the guy who knows how to operate the chainsaw that actually can do this work of sort of like fireproofing the forest, or you know, allowing the soil to, you know, hold more carbon and preventing the next mega fire than like someone like me or whatever. And so yeah, you know, I think that's so kind of surprising, particularly as someone who's like, oh, like I literally like to go around and just like sometimes hug trees, like that feels so good. You know, but also I think I need to learn how to cut trees down because I haven't really understood how a forest works until this point, and I haven't understood what makes a healthy forest, and maybe this terrible tangle isn't actually what forests historically have looked like. It's like the way I looked at the landscape changed. And once you see, you know, what an unhealthy forest and a healthy forest looks like, you can't really unsee it. And it just changes the way I looked at the world so completely. I think what's funny about the Franzen article is like when I alluded to it, I actually went back and I was like, maybe he writes about wildfires. I can't remember. And it's the same thing that we started out talking about, where like they're just kind of mentioned as like an evidence of the catastrophe that we're in. And certainly there's an argument that you can point to wildfires and say, yes, this is you know, an example of so much of what's gone wrong. But I love the historian Steve Pine, who's this fire historian who focuses on fire, has said, you know, even without a climate crisis, we would still have this wildfire crisis because it has a lot to do with the last 100 years of history and our approach to forest management and the way our removal of fire from this natural element on the landscape, our removal of that, that is causing so many of the problems, not just elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I love that, you know, for me, the Franzen article and the problem with just using wildfire as a sort of symbol that you just gloss over and it doesn't kind of make you stop and say, well, which wildfire? Like, are all wildfires disasters? Everything I learned in the process of researching this book says no, like not every wildfire is a disaster. In fact, we arguably are living in a fire deficit where we need more types of fire dependent on different regions and needs and histories of the land. And so that seems crazy to me that like we're using this thing as evidence of a disaster without stopping to really like see, well, wait, what is that? And actually by going into it and relearning this history and understanding how this actually works ecologically in the environment, like therein is the solution to a disaster that we're using it to illustrate. Like that doesn't seem right to me. And, you know, I've gotten more and more sensitive to it where now I'm just kind of like, I really think the media has failed in so many ways to really tell the, you know, the fullest story possible about fire and the wildfires that we see. So yeah, that's that's my rant.
It's really interesting because as you're saying that, I'm thinking I was just reading Chris Smage, who's the Small Farm Future guy. I was just reading his latest post on his blog today, and he was describing an encounter with someone who was responding to some of his work, who was saying, you know, look, we just need to stop farming. Farming's what's causing the climate crisis. And you know, there is a state of the discourse around climate change that is so bound up with urgency, with simple generalizations, and where people, you know, operating with the best of intentions, have produced, you know, what are dangerously kind of deranged and off track stories about where we are, what's happening, why, and what's needed. And again, the kind of the corrective to that I encounter involves people getting more closely involved with the specific and going, well, what farming, where, what kind of farming, why, you know, what fire, where, why? It's the same pattern.
And I think journalists have been, you know, complicit in that because so much of journalism, and I know this personally, it's like to use superlatives to make things dramatic. Like this is all part of our DNA as journalists to like make our stories important and exciting and all of these things. Like, and so I've seen that again and again where it just feels like, you know, we have contributed to that framing in a way that is extremely unhelpful. And for me, I think this book is the result of also just feeling very frustrated that that's not actually a good story to read, if you want to put it that way. Like, where does it leave people? Like, what are you supposed to do with a story, you know, that just says this is really, you know, this is a disaster, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, sometimes that is entirely appropriate, but it just seemed to me that there were other stories beyond that that are like better to read, like just better storytelling itself. Like that seems like maybe a more superficial motivation for it than, you know, thinking differently about the climate crisis. But it's like, well, maybe there's something to that, you know, like the fact that journalism and storytelling in that genre has kind of feels like it's hit a dead end with diminishing returns. So how can we use those same fact finding, truth telling skills in the service of like telling better stories that are actually more interesting and not just the same kind of narrative trope of like everything is disaster or, you know, apocalypse.
Yeah, no, I think you know, people often say from a kind of like publishing and editorial perspective, oh well, you know, you need to have a clear, simple story that people can follow. If you try and complicate it like this, I think your book's a great counterexample to that, because it does, there are whole sections of the book that read just as a kind of gripping, compelling story where we're right in the middle of these situations that most of us have never been in, that you're learning how to work and be useful in the middle of. And you succeed in bringing the complexity of what's going on. I guess one last question from me before we kind of close up the public part of this and open to questions from those who are with us on the call. I'm just curious if there's anything more you'd want to say about how the journey you went on in this book changed you. How are you different as a result of the people you got to know and worked alongside, and the kinds of skills that you learned in the process of this journey?
Well, I think so. One thing that wildland firefighters talk about, and I write a bit about this in the book, is like there's this phrase to be a student of fire, and you'll meet people who have had a career, either with like federal agencies here in the States or in fire for decades, and they still call themselves a student of fire. And I found that phrase like so captivating and kind of useful, because it described to me a very interesting kind of like posture towards their career and towards this element that they have sort of committed themselves to trying to understand. And it really was like this posture of kind of humility, like that even if you get to the end of a 40-year career, you're still a student of fire. And for me as a journalist who's like really interested in the ways like that science can and cannot explain the world to us, and like kind of the boundary of what it can and cannot explain, and why fire, and the fact that even seasoned, grizzled wildland firefighters will admit that they don't know everything about fire, is like incredible to me. That there's just this endless amount of learning that can take place, and that for me, discovering that I could actually fall in love with that kind of learning, and like feeling a sense of attachment to observing, being close to, and working with an element, was like a new thing for me completely. It was something that I didn't expect, and then just made me feel so like that attachment is very important. It's like what attaches us to the land and to each other. And I think for me, discovering that was really like something I had been looking for, to be honest. And it's weird to talk in those terms as a journalist, because it sounds very like sentimental. And I think part of my experience doing the book and writing about this topic was like admitting that I wasn't really going to be able to maintain that kind of like same objectiveness, or that position of objectivity, even as a narrator. Like I was going to have to admit that like, here I was a student, here I was falling in love with this thing. And hopefully, yeah, I don't know. And like one of my hopes was that people would read the book and just be like, find that thing that they really fall in love with in a way. That's just like,
absolutely.
that's so much fun. It's like, I don't know what that would always will look like, but like, oh, here I am, a middle-aged mom from Brooklyn, and like, I just want to light fires all the time now, like that's, and that's great.
It's so true. I sometimes say that the way the world is offered to us today, the way our culture offers us the world, is as this kind of incredibly broad but flat sort of screen of experience. And that what you wish for everyone, what you wish for children at some moment during their education, what you wish for as a parent for your own child, what you wish for people you meet in the course of adult life, is that somewhere along the way, a door in that flat surface opens up, and behind that door, you find the thing that is your kind of endless journey that you don't want to end.
Yes.
And it can be a skill or a craft or a practice. It can be, but it does involve some combination of a discipline of entering into the discipline of something and that quality of falling in love that you described. So yeah, I hope that the book will have that effect for people. It's time for us to wrap up the public part of this. So if you're watching this on YouTube or on my Substack, and then farewell. We're going to carry on for another 20 minutes or so. I'm going to unpin us and we're going to take questions.